So my name is Michael Robillard, and I'm a philosopher at the University of Oxford. And I focus mainly on the ethics of war. So in a past life, prior to my time as a professional philosopher, I was an officer in the United States military. I was an officer with the 82nd Airborne for 5 years, roughly. I spent 8 months in Iraq in 2003, 2004 as a light infantry platoon leader. And I exited the military in 2007 and have been doing philosophy in some capacity ever since. So, at least for the last 10 years since I've been out and trying to reintegrate back into civilian society, I've talked with a lot of other veteran friends from Iraq or Afghanistan, trying to sort of make sense of what it is that we took part in, and how to sort of fit back in and move past it. And I came across a book called Tribe by the war journalist Sebastian Junger. And what Junger looked at was that since World War II, there's been a decline in trigger time and combat time for soldiers from World War II through Korea, through Vietnam, through the existing engagements in Iraq and Afghanistan. And there's been an inverse relationship of reports of PTSD and psychological illness reported in soldiers. So that seems rather counterintuitive. And what I found, Junger's thesis was that when you're in a combat scenario and you're with a platoon and you're trusting one another with one another's lives, and you're in a context where you're living and sleeping right next to each other, you're eating next to each other, you're relying on one another for emotional support, and what's outside that bubble and outside that perimeter is the threat of imminent danger, that essentially mimics what would otherwise be a tribe in a more earlier hunter-gatherer epoch. And for the modern mind, that would have probably been one of the closest instances ever of sort of experiencing that type of bonding. So Junger's thesis is that what's sort of making present returning veterans so disoriented, it's not so much the amount of horror and traumas that they're being exposed to. Rather, it's the sharp and jarring transition from being in this sort of band of brothers moment back into 21st century alienating society, where we're amongst a rather thin and consumer-based society. People are very sort of atomic and individualistic in their social relationships, and it ends up sort of being like the wolf that's lost its pack. And in so doing, people lose their sense of identity and their sense of meaning or purpose in relation to some sort of overarching group or overarching project. And furthermore, I would argue that I think it has bearing on a lot of the maybe groups of young men or even older men that are feeling alienated in this sort of highly atomic post-informational, post-industrial society that we're in. So I'm not really sure what to do about that. I don't think that we need something like war or combat or life or death scenarios in order to be some sort of surrogate or proxy just for men to find solidarity or meaning or purpose. In fact, I think that's the very narrative that ISIS and a lot of extremist groups are tapping into. I'm sort of puzzling through this myself, and I'm hoping that at least some people would step up and begin leading and trying to put together these types of things, these types of groups that could express this sort of male energy and sense of meaning and bonding in a way that could be productive and build social fabric. In the absence of this, I'm worried that one of two things will happen. Either men will continue to be more sort of alienated and feeling without a place, or that energy could be co-opted by more pernicious groups with a lot worse agendas. I would end by saying that the scenario that I've described, or the state of affairs that I've described, I don't think it's endemic to soldiers. I don't think it's just endemic to men. I think it's endemic to really the post-21st century person. And what we really need to look at is our conception of the individual not as some sort of atomic entity cleaved from all culture, cleaved from all history, or cleaved from all relations, but really understand the individual as still important, but standing as in relation to a context, to a family, to friends, to a history, to a sort of social set of relations, as opposed to this sort of Cartesian atomic individual that is not grounded in anything bigger than itself. That's all I got.
My name's David Fuller. I'm a journalist, and I've recently started teaching men's work. And this is a bit of a story about how I got into men's work, what I got out of it, and it's about masculinity, and it's about my relationship with my father. It's a very personal story, but I hope that it's also in some way universal. When I've told it to people in the past, it's sort of, it seems to connect with something quite deep in the experience of having a father and maybe not getting on so well with your father and then trying to rebuild that relationship in the later years of your life. So we're going to pull back and start this story back in 2011 in Libya. I used to be a foreign producer with Channel 4 News. Tripoli was falling. Gaddafi was on the run. We came into Tripoli just as Gaddafi's regime was crumbling. So there's guns going off, people firing in the air. This is centre of Tripoli just as everything's going completely mental. So shortly after that we got to Gaddafi's tent. This is the burnt out Gaddafi's tent in the centre of Tripoli. And around us all of these guns are going off, people firing into the air. It's just this incredible moment. There's a few times in my journalistic career where I felt I'm in the middle of history. This is just an extraordinary place, an extraordinary experience. And we had a satellite phone. I thought, I really want to share this. So I called my parents, called my mum, and she answered the phone, and I said, listen to this. Just crazy, crazy moment, guns going off everywhere. And she started crying. And I said, okay, it's not that moving. I mean, I'm not in danger. And she then said, I'm at the hospital, I'm with your dad, he's just been diagnosed with stomach cancer. And we don't know much, but we know that stomach cancer is a diagnosis of stomach cancer usually means it's pretty advanced, and we think it's pretty bad. And he was young, he was fit, he'd just been on a cycling holiday literally just the week before. And so it's completely unexpected, completely out of the blue. And I knew it wasn't good. I started crying as well on the phone, and my bosses at Channel 4 News thankfully just put me on a plane straight back to the UK. And so as we're in the plane going back to the UK, I'm just going to take a little digression and fill in the gaps. Because growing up, I didn't get on well with my father at all. We always fought, and we still didn't get on even in 2011, just before this happened. And to be honest, I was a bit of a little shit to him growing up. I used to kind of take the piss out of him. There was a sort of conspiracy with my mother against him. And I never worked out why for a long time, but I was really nasty to him, and I'd push him. And I remember one time I pushed him so much that he grabbed me by my throat and held me up against a wall. And it didn't sort of dawn on me until later, and there was kind of a real sense of euphoria when that happened as well. And it never dawned on me until later why that had happened. It took me quite a long time to work it out. And a lot of it was through the kind of the men's work and the inner work that I'd done after that I sort of started to make sense of it. So my parents were very left-wing, very idealistic. My childhood was like CND marchers, delivering leaflets for the Labour Party. They were very rebellious as well, and naturism. Now, for about the next couple of minutes, I'm going to be speaking with a picture of my naked father behind me, but it's what he would have wanted. So my father was very much a kind of new man. He wanted to be very different from the male role models that he had, and he wanted to kind of be non-competitive and be be someone different from his father and what he'd seen growing up. Very non-competitive. I can remember when we played football, me and my brother, he'd say, "Why do you have to have a goal? Why can't you just pass it to each other?" And it took me a while but underneath he was really opinionated, he was really stubborn, he always thought he was right. Very different from me, as everyone who knows me will realise. And he could also get really, really angry and want his own way. And I think that's what I was doing when I pushed him, just sort of pushing that point, like to say, I know that's not authentic, that kind of non-competitive edge. There's something more there. And I pushed him until he snapped, until I found it. And my mum told me later on that just that moment really traumatized him. Like it took him a long time to get over that I pushed him to that point, that he grabbed me and that he realized that he had that in him. And it took a lot of sort of transformational work after that, where I started to really unpack the anger that I had towards my father and to really kind of understand it and recognize that all the things that I disliked in him, I had it. I had all of those things in myself and was really able to kind of understand the shadow of what I was pushing out in him was something that I also had. Because my experience of men's work is that, so I can speak for myself as a man, I have those edges, I have that aggression, I have that wanting to be right, I have that wanting to dominate, I have all of these things that can come out. And my experience is it's only through fully recognizing those and integrating them that I've become more whole as a man. To do what you could call the shadow work of really kind of looking at myself really deeply and then taking that anger, taking that aggression and using it, integrating it into the personality and then becoming sort of more present, more powerful. It becomes, I think, once integrated, a form of sort of personal power and becomes a kind of fuel certainly has become a kind of fuel for my life. And over probably since about 2006, when I first started doing workshops and starting doing this work, this sort of inner work from a place of crisis in myself, that I started to really kind of integrate some of these things. And on some level, I started to heal at least some of the relationship with him in myself. Although at this point, we hadn't kind of healed it in the outside world. So, plane's now about to land in the UK. And I go straight down to Southampton to see my dad in the hospital. And he's outside in the garden with my mum and a family friend. And I just go up to him and I embrace him. And for my friend, after a few minutes, my friend takes this picture, which is one of the most precious things I have in my life, I think. The hug probably lasted for about 10 minutes. It might have been even more. It sort of time stopped. And my friend realized at some point that he was in the presence of something special and got his phone out and took this picture. And something I think very profound happened in that moment. Some kind of healing happened. And I've had a few friends who've looked at this. A friend of mine touched it up and has turned it into a picture I have on my wall at home. And there's something about the way he's kind of collapsing into me and I'm holding him that's a kind of a transfer of some kind of, I don't know, as a child taking something and taking it from my father. That from what then happened, I feel that that's what happened in that moment. And I think what happened here catalyzed a lot of what happened next. Because shortly after that he got the diagnosis and he was diagnosed with 3 months to live. And that makes things real, obviously. And I then wrote him a letter and I said, look, I've been doing all of this work, I've done all these workshops, and I get these reflections from people in these workshops where people say, they talk about my authenticity or they talk about my honesty, and I realize these are your qualities. And I realized that I got them from you, and I've never been able to admit that to you. I've never been able to recognize all the good that I got from you. And he was very touched by that letter. And then I thought, well, he's going to be dead in 3 months. Why doesn't everyone, I don't want to hear at his funeral stuff that people should have said to him before. So I then got in touch with all of his friends, all of the family, everyone that he used to work with, as many people as I could, and said, he's going to be dead in 3 months. I want you to, what you might want to say at the funeral, I want you to say it now and send it to him. And so over the next 3 months, as he was becoming more and more ill, lying in bed, my mum was reading these to him. And all of this amazing stuff started coming in from former friends, work colleagues, family. So he was an arts officer for the council and created the Southampton Film Festival, saved the Theatre Royal in Winchester, created the street parties in the road. And my father's core wound was that he really didn't think he'd achieved very much in his life. He had a real down on himself and felt that he'd been a failure. He'd never really amounted to much. And this had really eaten away at him. And then somehow in the last 3 months of his life, some of that changed, some of that shifted just from the weight of all this stuff coming in. And the sheer love and outpouring of stuff that came in. And I'm sure that part of that was catalysed by that one moment and that one healing that I was able to do, and then to be there for him and then to produce. I'm sure it was catalysed by this moment. And then I took all of those and made it into a book that I gave to him for his birthday, sort of about 3 weeks before he died. Because there was also, when things like this happen, there's a Jordan Peterson quote where he talks about, be the person to rely on in a funeral. It's hard enough in a funeral, but it can be absolute hell if you haven't dealt with your family stuff. And I really feel, because all sorts of stuff came in. Some people are in denial. Some people are in, don't want to know. I mean, other members of my family just wanted it to go away. They weren't ready for, I feel that I was able to be there because of the work that I'd done. And yeah, it turned into a really beautiful experience rather than being absolute hell. Even though we were all there when he died, we were holding hands around his bed when he died, and it was very, yeah, it was one of the most, I now look back on it as one of the most precious moments of my life. And it's a wonderful story, and it's often, I told this sort of over the last few years, and this is normally where it ends, and but it's not where it ends. Because as someone who I believed my father's image of himself. Like I treated him as this failure growing up. I realised that I'd internalised the story that he had and treated him the same way he kind of treated himself. And then to have all of this come in at the age of 36, to realise by the time he was my age, he'd opened an art centre, he'd saved a theatre, he'd created the Southampton Film Festival, he'd had 3 kids. It's like, oh shit. This guy I thought was a failure had achieved far more at that stage than I had. And there's also something that, in my experience, when your father goes as a man, there's something archetypal. Even though I didn't get on that well with my father, there's something there that's missing, this sort of archetypal grounding point. And I really found that I had to go on a journey of myself over the next sort of 6 months to really find my path and find what I needed to do. And it then became like the hardest period of my life. Like I've had some real ups and downs over the last 6 years, just really trying to get my shit together and decide what it was that I was meant to be doing with my life and what I was meant to be bringing into the world. Yeah, it was pretty hard. And yeah, it's only in the last year I feel that I've really started to come out of that and realise what it is that I'm supposed to be doing. And it's leading men's work. Using my journalistic skills to tell the stories of this kind of transformational work, and then to lead the work, because you can't show someone a film and give them a transformational experience. You've got to give the transformational experience as well. And this is the work that I'm most passionate about, and this is what I've found the most helpful in my personal journey. And we consciously, in our workshops, we consciously bring in support of the father. It's a very kind of emotional piece for a lot of men to feel that, to model some healthy father energy in that workshop space. And we had a father in our last workshop who said he really wanted to go away and give that to his son. So as I was writing this yesterday, I wish that my father had had some of this, and maybe the relationship that I had with him would have been a bit different. But he did the best he could, and I'm really grateful for that. And I just want to, honour him by raising a toast to Michael. To Michael. To Michael.
I'm here tonight representing the organisation A Band of Brothers. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers, for he today who sheds his blood with me shall be my brother. Be he ne'er so vile, this day shall gentle his condition. Shakespeare's Henry V, and that was the inspiration for the name of our charity, that started about a decade ago. And we were sat in a loft, and there was a group of us, about sort of 17, 18 of us, and we'd all been doing the type of men's work that David was describing. That process of really looking at who am I, what should I do with my life, and is there any meaning and purpose? And we'd been doing this work for about 4 or 5 years, and we felt a huge amount better about ourselves. But as we sat there in that loft in Hove, we realised that if there is a crisis in masculinity, it wasn't really amongst us. Because we were pretty white, pretty middle class, and pretty privileged. And that maybe, just maybe, if we were to set about trying to do something to address some problems that we saw in society, where we should be focusing our efforts was in the council estates, where we knew that young men were leaving care, going into the prison system, getting locked up, returning from the prison system more damaged and fucked up than they were when they went in. And what would it be like for us to set ourselves the challenge of reaching out a hand to them? Going back to the ancient traditions of the older men in a society believing it to be their responsibility, their sacred charge, to initiate the younger men, to say to the younger men, this is how we do stuff round here. This is what we expect from you. And in return, this is what you can expect from us. It's not a one-way street, being a man in this tribe. And we believed that social contract, that bond had been lost. And what would it be like if we tried to recreate that? So that was 10 years ago. And what I'm going to do now is show you and allow you to hear the voices of some of the young men and some of the volunteers that we've worked with over the past decade. And then I'm going to return and talk a bit about what we've learned in the 10 years that we've been doing this work.
Well, if you think about communities and the safety of communities, they're most sort of at risk through unsocialised young men, really.
I remember seeing my dad going down the road from his house when he handcuffs, and I was there. And my mum broke down about it. I got put in the cell, and I said I'd never do it again. And then I got home, I'd done it again, and I ended up back in the cell.
I don't know what it would take to become a man. It's just one of them things.
We, as a community of men, recognise that all of us are wounded. All of us have our own issues. All of us are struggling to answer the big questions of life of who am I really? What should I do with my life? And is there really any meaning or purpose? And we engage in those questions with the young men.
It's like I'm living a new life that I always wanted to live, you know?
Who are we? A band of brothers! What we do is we take young men, referrals from the probation service, and we approach them and we offer them the call to adventure. Do you want to come and see what maybe is behind and driving what your life looks like? And those young men have often never had an invitation quite like that. We take them away to the woods We take them off to the woods. We take them away from their known world. And surrounding those 10 or 12 men on those rites of passage weekends are 25 grown men from their community. We set out with a belief and a hypothesis that what the young men were looking for was meaning, purpose and belonging. Meaning, purpose and belonging. And that was certainly borne out. And for too many men in this country, there is an absence of meaning, purpose and belonging. What we didn't realise when we started doing this was how much our older male volunteers were also desperately in need of meaning, purpose and belonging. And that bringing those two groups together has been deeply, deeply healing. Because instinctively, I felt scared of young men. I still notice it come up in me occasionally, even now, even after doing this work for years and years. I'll walk past a group of males in hoodies at a bus stop and part of me will feel scared. And yet now, chances are I might know one of them. Another thing that we're seeing is that Jules spoke earlier about the stiff upper lip, the kind of the traditions of the upper class Englishman that started perhaps with that sentiment of the definition of a bore is an Englishman who, when you ask him how he is, he actually tells you. So there's that kind of thing, and we heard about that boarding school of environment of never showing any fear. And do you know what? It's the same for the young men growing up on the council estates, going to prisons, like being in those environments. They are not, the only emotion that they can show is anger. Grief and sadness, no. Fear, no. Like love and joy, no. So their emotional range, a lot of the emotional range of men and young men gets channeled into a very, very narrow funnel. So we see that the work that we're doing in allowing men and young men to improve their emotional literacy, to express the grief, the sadness, the shame, the fear that might have been inside them for years without finding ground, we believe is really, really important. The other thing that we're finding is that men need community. And I used to say to funders and people that came down to see our work, I used to tell them that this is my community. This isn't just a youth project. This is my community. These men in this community will bury me when I go. And that was always a kind of, it was a construct. But last year what happened is that one of those men that was sat in that room with us in Hove 10 years ago died. I'll bring his name here tonight, Peter. And Peter died. And we as a community held that process, held his funeral. The young man that he first mentored went up to the woodland burial site and was part of a group of men digging the grave that would hold that man, telling stories of what they remembered and what they celebrated about Peter. And wow, that sent ripples right through our community, knowing that that's how we look after each other. That's how we look after our own. So whilst we're creating social good, we're also getting a huge amount of value for ourselves. And that for me is what service really looks like. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
What's the value of having groups of just men? Because some of what you were talking about is kind of sharing and vulnerability, and that can happen in different kinds of groups, can't it? So what is the value of doing it with just men?
There's two parts to it, really. One is that what will happen in a co-gender group is that as a heterosexual man, I will start to try and establish some rank.
because I'll be aware of which of the women that I want to sleep with, and I will want to look good. And that will mean that I'm showing up in a different way to if I wasn't doing that. And I feel quite embarrassed admitting to this, but that's how it works. And there's also something that's a bit kind of subtler than that, which is that because I do co-gender work, I think there is absolutely a place for doing co-gender work, especially in the times of Me Too. I believe there is a massive need for men and women to hear each other's stories, going beyond the stereotypes, beyond all of the kind of stuff. I think there's absolutely a need for that. And what can sometimes happen in co-gender groups is that I will expect, unconsciously, the men will expect the women in the group to do the stereotypically feminine emotions. So the men will expect the women to hold the vulnerability, the sadness, the grief. And it can become polarizing. Whereas when it's in an all-male group, we find ourselves manifesting and experiencing those emotions, demonstrating them, modeling for the young men that we can be in an authentic space of masculinity and in those emotions. And, you know, at the weekend, we do all of that stuff that's traditionally seen as, in our polarized gendered society, as being feminine. So we cook and we clean and we look after the young men and we clear their plates and we do all of that stuff because they've often never experienced being nurtured by other men. And often they don't honour that part within themselves. So that's kind of why we do it as single gender groups.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I would say there's a couple of things that I completely agree with Nathan, that when a woman enters the room, men's behaviour changes. It's just something that happens on a very subtle level, and performance comes in or whatever. There's an element of inauthenticity that can come in very easily, but also I think there is something that we can give to each other as men that really feeds us on a deep level. Someone's called it vitamin M, that we're all craving for on some level, and this is a really bodily. I think you probably agree. There's a bodily experience of some kind of sustenance that comes in that I'm sure is related to kind of this deep evolutionary history of being around men and doing things together with men, and it's a real felt sense. It's like you don't know that you're missing this, but you are, and that really comes in. I think in that space, it's like on a much deeper level.
We knew when we started doing this, well, we had a suspicion that the young men would really value an older man blessing them, looking them in the eyes and going, what I see in you, young man, is a fine soul. Somebody who really cares about those around them, somebody who so really blessing them. And we were absolutely spot on in that. And that means a huge amount to the young men. What we didn't realise was how much we as older men were craving the blessing of the younger men. For them to say to us, do you know what? Nobody's ever cared about me, and you lot have. Thank you. And it was just like, wow. Like that just meant so much. And we didn't see that coming.
I would certainly very much like to hear from some of the women in the room about what their feelings are listening to some of the stories that have been shared, or some of the experiences, or what's come up for them in terms of hearing some of the things that have been shared tonight.
I would like to say that I have really appreciated that you guys don't have a front today. I really feel that what you have said has come from you personally, and I think that is what a lot of women are missing out on, frankly, when they're talking to men. Talk to a boss, talk to a colleague. We don't try and see behind your fronts. And I really appreciate today that you guys have been personal and honest, and you've trusted that people have listened to you without judgment. And I think I really appreciate that as a woman, listening to you guys today.
The reason why I came here today is to see whether or not there's anything women can do to support men, to help them have a more positive healthier kind of version of masculinity, or whether we should just like step back. Do you know what I mean? So I wanted to hear from men, and I guess I would like to hear maybe from you guys what you think on that, what women can do to support this, I suppose.
Well, I mean, what I'd say for myself is that through really connecting to my masculinity in the work has really enabled me to connect with the women in my life. I mean, the kind of the terminology is to connect with the feminine. Like, connecting to my masculine has allowed me really to connect with the feminine. And I feel that's in myself as well as outside. It's rooting myself really into my masculine has really allowed me to connect with my own inner feminine, and then with the women in my life. So that, but I think there is something that we have to do for ourselves.
Yeah, in terms of kind of growing out of my toxic model of masculinity in my early 20s, the friendship of women was so crucial to that. I mean, I would say even now I've probably got more close female friends than male, because it was just easier to have authentic, conversations with them. But I think that David's right that it can't be just that. I mean, I think I still have issues around trusting men and opening up with men, and so there is. I kind of I've been converted by these guys to the idea that there is some good work to be done. With I've never been to a men's group, but I mean I'm more open to the idea. That there is a kind of healing in terms of trusting other men as well.
I made a really bad mistake, which was a female friend of mine and I were talking about the Me Too stuff. And she said to me, "You men all have a problem. You need to sort this out." And I was just like, hang on, you wouldn't approach a person of Muslim faith and say, "Do you know what? You Muslims have got a real problem with, kind of extremism in your community. You all need to sort it out." So why do you think that all men are responsible for the actions of extremists like Harvey Weinstein within our community? That's not to say that we don't have issues around sex and stuff that we need to work through, but there is something in that. Because what I missed in that was the opportunity to say to her, because what she went on to disclose was that actually she'd been sexually assaulted when she was younger, and that still carried a lot of stuff around it. And because of how the conversation had gone, I didn't get to say to her, that was wrong, and that I'm sorry that happened. And I didn't get to grieve with her for what was lost in the moment, because I was too in my own reaction around all of you men and carrying the burden and the shame of all of that collective stuff. So, that would be the other thing I would say on a more serious note, to, for all of us as human beings to look when we're generalising and when we're giving somebody stuff that isn't theirs to own.
It's actually one for you, David. I was really moved by your story, and I was wondering if you have any ideas or thoughts about how that sort of rapprochement, or how that changing that relationship could happen before it gets to that stage, as it were. Because I think many people would rather it is often left to that lateness, isn't it? And that actually you want to do it before. And I have tried to do this with my own father, and tried to have that sort of deep and meaningful conversation. I think he just found it a bit awkward and weird, and wasn't really willing to go there. And for me, it would seem a shame to leave it to that same stage when it's so late in the day.
Yeah, very good question. I wish it hadn't been sparked by that, and by that shortened time span, and made it all more intense. There's only so much you can do. You can only offer. You can't change the way it's received. There's a course that I did once that said, and it was about kind of healing with your parents, and what they said is open the conversation by saying, what was it? I love you, and I know that you've always loved me. And that recognition of their love was the thing that would open the door, and it worked. Well, I think I said it to my mum, and she said, "Yeah, I know." But I'd already said that to my dad, and it hadn't fixed the relationship. So there's always more work to do in ourselves as well. There's often stuff it's like it's difficult to know whether it's really coming from a resolved place in ourselves, and then whether we can actually come from that place of healing.
My relationship improved a lot with my dad when I was in a really bad accident. So we bonded through that. So any major injury. Doesn't have to be cancer.
Yeah, on this one, I feel, because I have such a great relationship with my dad, I mean, we have some incredibly deep conversations about the weather and what's going to happen in the next 48 hours meteorologically. And you know what? He's just not ready for those conversations, anything deeper. And, you know, what I've come to accept is a couple of things, really. One is that we all want a Superman for our fathers and what we get as a human being, and that's you know, some stuff to work through. And the other thing for me as well is to accept that, like, my dad's dad went off to war in the Second World War, came back, couldn't really speak about it, didn't ever speak about it, didn't ever really parent my dad. And so he is who he is, and I ended up who I am, and that perhaps our generation are the ones with the tools that we can use to just gently try and unlock every now and again, but wait till it's right, and hopefully it won't be the 3 months to go stage that David was.
Yeah, I think it's pretty difficult to create a relationship that he doesn't have anywhere else in his life. Like, it's very difficult to create a closer relationship than any of the other relationships that someone has. That's very difficult.
I want to ask you about Superman. This word came up. Thanks, all of you, for sharing such being so courageous. I'm going to use that word, being vulnerable and sharing a little bit of your own honest truths and stories. It's really moved me and been something quite powerful to encounter. I guess I'm interested to ask you personally, as men, fellow men, what you do about your urge to fix the world, or to try and be a Superman, to solve things, to have the answer, to build a program that's going to be, you know, the thing. Maybe this is a kind of a man problem, I don't know. Or is it okay? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I have had that. I definitely see it in my brother as well. Jung called it like the archetype of the eternal boy, like the golden child who will kind of on a mission to save the world. And men can be very into hero archetypes, and personal development can really draw on that as well. Like, you go on a hero's journey and so forth. And I still feel it in me sometimes as well. You know, what am I going to do to set the world on fire? And I guess one thing I can do is recognize that sometimes the real work is accepting yourself when you haven't done something amazing, and you're not on some massive mission. So that can be the hardest work, when you're not kind of caffeined up and thinking, this is going to be the thing, you know. So yeah, I think just recognizing that tendency in oneself, and that it can be a form of unkindness to one. Because, you know, like, who am I when I'm not a superhero, when I'm not being amazing? And can I accept myself in that is, I think, really hard work.
Yeah, I guess, you know, so I guess by now a lot of people are familiar with the Jordan Peterson meme of you know, clean up your room, and sort of this notion of starting small and becoming responsible for one's own sort of inner world and local space, and without getting overwhelmed by trying to solve all the world's problems with some one utopian grand plan. You know, so I think that there's definitely an element and a sentiment to that makes a lot of sense.
So trying to fix the world has nearly killed me on several occasions, and fortunately I've now come to a place with it where I'd still like to fix the world, if I'm honest, but I won't consider myself a failure if I don't manage to do it. And that for me feels like a much more comfortable position to be in. And so for me there's this kind of balance of not abdicating, but also not overreaching and not projecting my own psychological fuck-ups onto external forces and going out and campaigning with that. And I think that's really what Jordan Peterson is saying, like, you know, don't project your wounds and vulnerabilities out there into the world and concentrate on that. Fix that stuff first. Once you've got far enough with that to not be a liability, putting yourself out there, crack on, get on with it, go do it. So that's kind of my work in progress around it.
So I work with young people with a charity called Mind, and my job is in service design currently. So I'm looking at how can we help young people in schools and reimagine mental health support for young people in schools. So I spent the last sort of 6 weeks running focus groups with young people, and if the young people aren't forced to be there, then it will always be girls. If they're cherry picked, then you can get boys in the room as well. But even when the boys are in the room, getting them to actually use their voice and to articulate their inner experience is incredibly difficult and draining. This has been replicated across every South London school that I've been in. It's the same thing, the boys not speaking up. You've had some of these huge campaigns like Time to Change that's taken on mental health stigma, for example, from a seemingly unassailable position and beating it down to a point where it's kind of okay to say I'm struggling now, much more so than before. And I'm curious to know, are funders, are governments, do you see it on the horizon that this stuff is actually going to be looked at, that perhaps it might be a good idea to start tackling this problem a little bit further upstream rather than waiting till the young people burn the village down just to feel the warmth?
How long have we got? It's a huge question, and I think I could go in and pick apart lots of different bits of that. The thing for me, the piece I think that we can do, is that bit about imagining what the healthy journey from being a young boy to a mature adult man looks like. And rather than focus on pathologizing the problems, really focus on what does the positive journey look like, and can we lobby for those stages to be included within the curriculum in schools?
I would say you need to work out how to get them into the room. I wouldn't have gone to a mental health voluntary workshop when I was a teenager. I might have gone to one on ideas and philosophy. You could do one on like sport and values, where you have some kind of game and then a kind of discussion afterwards, or something like music and then some discussion afterwards. So come at it sideways rather than straight on as we're going to fix you. So that's my suggestion.
Yeah, I think that's a really great idea. I think it's very difficult to reach men just by saying this will make you more healthy or you'll be more in touch with your emotions. It's like, okay, and why? It's like, okay, this will help you get into a state for making better music, or this will help you get into a state for making better art, or something. I mean, something around that. I mean, we're having this conversation as well with Rebel Wisdom. We're thinking about doing sort of martial arts to kind of tap into, come and release your anger in a martial arts session, and then do some sharing around it and reframe it within kind of I think there has to be a function beyond just the therapeutic benefit of it. And I think no one's cracked it yet. We're kind of talking about it as well. And I think the other thing is mainstreaming this personal growth conversation. It has to be made mainstream, and it hasn't been yet. And that's sort of something I think we're all, like, part of this evening tonight is kind of, there's clearly an appetite for it from the response that there's been in the room. And we're going to wrap up now and say thank you very much for all of you who came and asked some great questions and some great responses in the break. To Nathan from Band of Brothers. To Michael from the US Army and Oxford University. And to Jules from the London Philosophy Club and best-selling author. And David, Rebel Wisdom, thank you very much.